No. Oh, excellent. It works. Technology works. So, hey, I'm late. You know what happens when you're late for class and you start running and then you realize you're the professor and you can't start without me. So then you start walking more slowly. That's what, hey, what just happened? All right, that's not good. What's wrong with this process here? Okay, let's try it again. It was on a second ago, right? It wasn't? It wasn't? Okay. Okay, I'm rebooting the system. While that's happening, am I mic? Can you hear me? Yes, no? All right, we'll wait. But in the meantime, I can speak loudly, so while I'm not mic'd, I need you to be quiet. Quiet, thank you. So while we're waiting for the computer to turn on March 24th, on next Tuesday, I will not be here. So, you shouldn't be pleased by that. So we have a guest lecturer, Mathieu Chalifot, who's a grad student, and there's a link I put on the slide here. He won our inaugural PowerPoint karaoke contest, and that's a contest where we randomly put up presentations and you have to like present on the spot with no text or anything, and he won. So I put a link to his performance on YouTube, which is quite extraordinary. So he should be, why? Come on, turn on. So he should be fairly entertaining. Now that I've raised the expectations, that's great. In the meantime, you will note as well that the internal deadline for finishing your abstracts for the poster is March 26th. Okay, so that's next week. That's a full week more than the other class gets. Because I like you. See how that works? And it's worth 5 of the 25 marks of the poster presentation. So all you gotta do is get it done and you get the full 5 marks. If you're late, you get 0 of the 5 marks. So that's the downside. But if you get anything in, anything resembling an abstract, that's the full 5 marks. And the remaining 20 will be given by the judges on the day of the event. We'll talk a bit more today about what that looks like. But there's a link. The Surveymonkey Link is what you use to upload your team names, the name of the thing, and your abstract. The length limit is 300 words. It was changed from 250 because the other class does 300. We're trying to standardize as well. The reason that the 26th is the deadline is because the organization needs them all by the 27th. Here we go. So we can publish the abstract book. And if your abstract's in the abstract book, it goes on your CV as a publication. So it's in your really intense interests to get this done by the 26th, hopefully earlier than that. Right, so some people had approached me to talk about what's in the abstract. We talked a bit about that last time. Remember that the research question is everything. We'll talk a bit more about research questions today in the experimental section. But what you want to do is phrase a research question that hopefully includes the elements of the PICO method. Doesn't have to, that's really advisable because the judges have been instructed to look for that kind of structure. So hopefully you're comparing something, hopefully there's an intervention or some element like a disease or something you're comparing and an outcome measure you're looking for. I really advise you to choose the population you're examining quite narrowly. That makes your life so much easier. And specify that population in your title and in your research question. For example, amongst Canadian 12-year-olds, suffering from Alzheimer's, 12-year-olds with Alzheimer's, what is the effect of coffee drinking on whether or not they trip and break their ankles? I don't know. But you want some kind of intervention at a specific population. Now, many people have asked me, how many studies should you find? As I said last time, there is no rule. And I won't write down a rule. But wink, wink, your life is much easier with something between 10 to 20. It doesn't have to be. Science is whatever you find is what you get. But your life is easier if you get, at least 10-ish, not more than 20. And the reason for that is you want to show something on your table. And anything that's too much will be too distracting. Anything that's too little will cause you to panic. So structure your search parameters such that you find about 10 to 20. That's cheating. But to do this properly, you need a whole year. You've got like a week. So it's okay to cheat a little bit. Right? So you've got to game the system and phrase your research questions such that when you do the search, you'll find what you find. Now, when it comes to the methods section, give enough information that if someone does exactly what you say, they will find exactly what you find. So give the keywords, the databases you searched, the limitations in your exclusion, inclusion criteria, all that sort of thing. In your discussion section, it resembles a paper, but it's not a paper. It's much easier than a paper. It's just a poster with a few points. Bullet points are fine. Okay, in your discussion, there's no rules, but I recommend that you follow the BMJ framework, which is a 4-section approach. The first thing is repeat the major findings. So if you're looking at, is there a relationship between caffeine intake and reduction in Alzheimer's? Say, of the 18 studies we found, 6 found association, 4 didn't, and 2 were pointless. Whatever, just restate it. The second thing you do is you talk about the limitations of your study. We only looked at English language publications. We only looked for randomized controlled trials. And in fact, there's probably a bunch of observational trials out there. We're limited to what their library had because they're not willing to pay money to get more papers. That's fine. Just stipulate what affects or biases your findings. The third thing you do is the hardest thing, and that's contextualize your findings within what is known in the literature. Use words like it's surprising or not surprising, right? It's, according to Smith et al., they found that there was no relationship between coffee drinking and Alzheimer's. We're surprised that we found something. Show that you've gone beyond cranking the machine like any monkey can do and bring some intellect into the game. That's what elevates your work above undergrad student into a scientist. And the last thing is you make recommendations for future work. So we recommend that a randomized controlled trial be designed in this way that explores this in more depth. And the final thing you do in your poster is a conclusion. And I really recommend you have one and that you answer the research question. So the research question should be phrased in such a way that it's answerable, i.e., is there an association between coffee drinking and Alzheimer's disease? Your conclusion, according to our results, there is no association. Straightforward stuff. It's not difficult. It shouldn't take you more than a few days, to be honest. Obviously, it's your first time doing it, you'll be nervous and things like that, but the structuring is fairly formulaic. Okay, any questions about the poster so far? We'll go over this again next week, probably. Yes?
In the chart of what we need to do, there's something about like the initial presentation.
Initial presentation?
Once the judge comes to the poster.
Okay, so the way the day will unfold is you will have your poster set up, and you're all sitting there nervously and well-dressed and caffeined up, and the judges will make their way around. They'll have a schedule of who they're judging, and they'll come to you and they'll say, go. And you will speak for, I forgot, it's 5 to 10 minutes, I forgot how long it is. And make sure that every member of your team speaks. Don't read off what's on the poster. Have something prepared where you summarize what you did. Our topic was caffeine intake and Alzheimer's disease. We did a search of this and we found this, and therefore we believe this, this, and this. That's the presentation. Then the judges will ask you questions. And they won't be mean. Well, maybe 1 or 2 will be mean. But in general, they'll be collegial and cooperative. And they'll ask you questions like, have you tried doing this instead? Why did you choose this dosage of caffeine? Why did you look at only odds ratios and not other kinds of outcomes, right? Why did you choose this topic? Those are all fair game questions. And it's okay to say, we don't know. Or we didn't learn that in our class. This is all we know. Or whatever. Just be honest. Yep. Yes?
Should the title of our poster be the same thing as our research questions? Or should we
whatever you like. It doesn't really matter.
should put the population in the title?
No, not necessarily. You can.
Okay.
There's no rules for title. Except anything you put on your poster is fair game for questioning. Like I told you, the first time I judged, someone's title was the burden of, dementia in Canada, and I asked how you define burden, and they didn't have an answer. Right? So make sure the words you use are defensible. You know what they mean. Okay. Cool. Moving on. Oh, am I mic'd? Can you hear me? Is that good? Is the microphone on? Yes, no, maybe? No one seems to know. Am I mic'd or not? Okay, I'll assume that I am. And let's make sure I'm recording right now. I am recording. Excellent. Okay. So how it all begins. Let's go back to the scientific method again. So I mentioned at the beginning of class that much of epidemiology really has in its roots the fundamentals of scientific philosophy, right? So we kind of forget that. In high school, you learn about the scientific method. You know, there's an idea, there's a design, there's data, there's a conclusion. And then you go through your undergrad education, and that kind of gets lost in the details. You're in labs pouring shit, and you never think about the philosophy and the steps that you followed about interrogating a question. So let's remember that the method flows like this. There's an idea followed by an hypothesis. So Newton's sitting on the tree, he has an idea around gravity, he hypothesizes, well, maybe if I dropped an apple, it'll accelerate this amount, and so forth. He has a research question that's based on that hypothesis. The research question is testable, a data source to inform the research question, some kind of design for how to do the experiment, and a project arises. And after that comes data collection, analysis, and conclusions. But this is kind of the flow, right? So, pygmies with doofus disease I've seen were all left-handed. That's my observation. So hypothesis, well, maybe all pygmies are left-handed pygmies are likely to have doofus disease. So here, this question flows from that supposition. Notice this is measurable, and that's kind of conversational. Data source, well, maybe there's a clinic somewhere that has patient records of doofus disease in pygmies, right? I'm going to use a cross-sectional design and so forth, right? So that's how we flow from this. We tend to use the words hypothesis and research question fairly interchangeably. Different professors probably have different definitions of what they are. I'm going to give you mine, right? Research question is answerable, it's testable, and hypothesis is more suppositional. So this is one of Dr. Gomez's slides. I won't go too deeply into it because it's just information that will just fill out any sort of gaps you may have. But important bits here are the outcome measures. So when you're doing your searches in your poster, you're looking for certain outcomes. So let's say your question is there a relationship between caffeine intake and reduction of the incidence of Alzheimer's disease? Okay, how do you measure relationship? Are you going to look at just odds ratios, or just relative risks, or just incidence measures? Or maybe they're qualitative, like this guy says that it is reduced, whatever it might be. You have to make that decision early on, that this is what we care about. Okay, so here we have very measurable outcomes, like blood glucose levels. Here we've got risk measurements. Here we have qualitative measurements around ability. It varies a lot. So I mentioned there's a difference between a hypothesis and a question. You have your topic, which is very, very broad. You have a very specific, I got the reverse, sorry. A question is specific, a hypothesis is testable. These things, depending on who you ask, it gets reversed. Just pick one model, right? So don't use the words research question and hypothesis together in your poster. Use one and just say it's the testable thing that we're trying to do. We hypothesize that, or we are questioning that. Okay. I'm moving fast because I came late, sorry. So here's an example. Physical activity and cardiovascular disease. Problem, is there a link between lack of physical activity and hypertension? The question, will 30 minutes of moderate activity reduce office hours, right? So our research question is what we're going to answer, and hypothesis is where the stats go. Okay, so this usually is where we put into our method section. And this stuff here usually goes in the background section. Again, no hard and fast rules, but if you're looking for guidance, this kind of helps. But make sure that somewhere there's something testable and answerable in your design. Right, so here's from your poster. You can have a topic, let's say it's autism and diet. Your question, is eating cheese in the first few years of life associated with having autism? Method. Now, you're all going to have very similar, if not identical, methods. You're going to have literature review of peer-reviewed studies published after a certain point. Now, I advise you to be very, very specific. So here's your cutoff date. Here is when we decide to search. And make it defensible. So someone will ask you, why did you only choose after 1990? And the answer would be, that's how far back the database goes. Or that's when a certain definition of the disease originated. Or we chose that because that gave us the maximum number of results. And before that, there weren't a whole lot of papers written. We tend to have somewhat arbitrary cutoffs for searches, and we struggle to defend those decisions. Find some kind of defense for it, just in case a judge asks you. You can go back to the dawn of time. That really sort of triples your workload, and you'll go back to the point where there are no electronic records. What are you going to do? Look up physical papers at that point? There's not enough time. Okay? And we use these keywords, autism, cheese, and so forth. Right? Our results. The results are the papers that you find, are the studies that you find. The results necessarily aren't the association of the conclusion. The results are just your search results. You found this number of studies, we reviewed 12 of them, this many found an association, and so forth, and etc. I recommend that your results be reported in a table format, in addition to graphs and pictures. And this table, I recommend, has several columns. The first column is identifying the study that you find. So Smith and Smith published in such, and maybe link it to your bibliography. The second column should be a description of the population that they looked at. The third column could be something like the study design. This was a randomized controlled trial. This was an observational study, whatever it might be. By the way, there's no rules around what order they go in. Just make sure these elements are there. Next can be the outcome measure of interest that you care about. The relative risk was an odds ratio, whatever it might be. And they found this, right? They found an odds ratio of 7 of an association between cheese and autism, whatever it might be. And the last column have something around commentary. So we think this is a bad study. We think this is a good study. We think it's too big. It's underpowered. We think it's whatever it might be. It just looked at women, so it's biased, or whatever it might be. Okay? Show that you're bringing something intellectual to the game, some process of assessing the relevance of that paper to your question. That's not that difficult, but it shows a thoroughness of your approach. It goes beyond simply cranking a machine that any monkey can do. And your conclusion. So we found some evidence, some design issues here. Now, in between here, I recommend have something resembling a discussion, right, where you talk about this is what this means and has those 4 elements I talked about before. The people in the first section and the other class probably won't have that discussion component because they haven't been told to do so. I'm encouraging you to do so because it adds an element of richness that the judges will be pleased to see. Okay, that's poster stuff done. Any comments or questions about that very rushed summary of the poster stuff? Okay, y'all are kind of glazed over. Good, all right. Sufficiently confused. Okay, so today we're talking about experiments. Right, that's one experiment joke. The police call, we're taking you out of a clinical trial and putting you in a criminal trial. Yeah, it's funny. So remember this, back to this design again, this cascading diagram of where I think various population studies fall. We've already gone through the observational studies. Now we're into the interventions and clinical trials, which are types of experiments. Those aren't the only types of experiments. We'll talk about other types of experiments in a future class, but these are probably the ones that are commonly known in epidemiology and probably you've been commonly exposed to already in your other studies. So remind me again, what's the distinction between an observational study and an experiment? Do you remember the distinction between the two? Yes?
Experiment, you actually manipulate.
That's right. The investigator manipulates something in the experiment. And what they manipulate is who gets the intervention. Whereas in the observational studies, that's naturally unfolds. People choose of their own free will to pursue a lifestyle or behavior that exposes them to something or doesn't expose them to something. You just stand back and watch. In the future, when we show different types of nuanced experiments, like a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment, you'll see that these lines get a little bit blurred. That's why I keep asking you all the time what the distinction is, because I want to drill it home that that's really the defining characteristic. So when you see these other more subtle and confusing definitions of experiments, you can quickly associate them with this group and not that group. But we'll get there in a couple of classes. Right? So recall as well the pyramid of evidence. This pyramid of evidence ranks which studies are deemed to be the most rigorous and the most compelling in terms of describing a relationship between two things, usually an exposure and outcome. And we said last time that people's opinions are the worst kinds of evidence. Looking at individual situations are the next worst. Case control, not that great. Cohort's pretty good. The absolute best thing is a systematic review based upon randomized controlled trials, but near the top are the randomized controlled trials. And we often use the term gold standard for the RCT. The RCT is the gold standard experiment, meaning that if it passes an RCT, chances are what we perceive and measure is the absolute God's truth. Unfortunately, it's not always the case. As you find out, there are no absolutes in this game. And many experts will say that, in fact, a really good randomized controlled trial is probably better than a systematic review. Systematic review just summarizes what a bunch of randomized controlled trials did, and not all of those randomized controlled trials may have been the best. On the other hand, if you get the very best RCT, that's probably better than a summary of some okay RCTs. So again, there are no absolutes here, but the rule of thumb is systematic review is probably more convincing than a single RCT. Why would you need more one RCT? Let's say I'm measuring whether or not omega-3 fatty acids reduce the incidence of cardiovascular disease. And there's a really good RCT that was done a few years ago that showed, yes, there's a strong association. So they did another one, and another one, and another one. Why did they do it more than once? Yes? Got to confirm the results, because science is all about repetition. But also, there are subtle differences each time. Maybe the population we looked at is not the same. So a really good RCT would be so strenuously controlled, looking at 35-year-old white women who speak English who live in Ottawa and have 2 kids, right? So someone might say, well, does it really apply to like young men who are childless and live in Toronto? I don't know. Let's find out. Okay, that's just one example. So the very nature of the RCT being as controlled and rigid as it is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in that we can really separate out these extraneous, biasing, confounding variables. It's a curse in that it makes it less and less inclusive and generalizable. The more controlled we get, the less real-worldy we get, in other words. So we all try to redo them over and over and over again. Okay. Again, this is one of Dr. Gomez's slides. We went over this already, what the null hypothesis is, but I want to remind you what the null is. If you remember statistics, your null hypothesis is the statement that nothing's going on. And this is the base assumption of the nature of reality in an experiment. We assume, first off, that there is no relationship, that the drug does not work, that there's no association between this exposure and this outcome. And we struggle to see if we can design a scenario that disproves the null or rejects the null. So our statistics are based upon that. Our statistics are very conservative. We try to reject the null. Can we ever accept the null? Why not? Okay, I'll let you think about that again. Can we cover this already? So if you don't understand why we can't accept the null, I want you to think about it, and we'll revisit this later. So here's some terminology here. The H sub naught is how we usually express the null hypothesis in statistics, and usually we're saying it's something is equivalated here. Now this stuff down here, sometimes we can say a null is about an inequality. Don't worry about that. That's very rare. Usually it's this. So we're saying the control group and the treatment group are the same. The pi is proportions. The proportion of people who gets lung cancer from a smoking group is the same as the proportion of people who get lung cancer in the non-smoking group. Or here it's the mean. So the mean glucose concentration in the group that got the diabetes drug is the same as the mean glucose concentration in the blood of the group that didn't get the diabetes drug. Right? So we always assume that the drug didn't do anything. We use a drug example a lot with RCTs because RCTs are most commonly drawn by drug companies. RCTs are insanely expensive to do correctly. And that's why they're often done by drug companies, who have a lot of money. Does it have to be a biological thing that we run a randomized controlled trial on? Can we do social experiments using randomized controlled trials? Yes, we can. Can you give me an example? You think of one. No one can think of a social experiment? Yes?
Like I've heard of this one before where they were testing, they had like a certain group go into a room and then they put smoke under the door and see who acts in what way and if men act a certain way. So they're being manipulated.
Sure. So psychological tests are very often randomized controlled trials, and that's a freakishly almost unethical one, so I'm surprised that gets ethics.
It was like safe, it was just to see.
Yeah, I get it. More commonly, you get things in the educational world that are randomized controlled trials. For example, this class or several classes will be randomly selected out of a high school to receive a new curriculum, and other classes will not receive a new curriculum, and we'll see at the end of the school year which class does better on their grades. Okay? That's a very sloppy randomized controlled trial, but it's a randomized controlled trial. Why? Because they're randomly chosen, and there's a control group, and I control the intervention. The intervention was this curriculum that came into play. If I'd allowed the people to choose their own curriculum, that would be more of an observational study. Okay, so anyway, so even though we're going to use the terms drug a lot, don't be misled. Randomized controlled trials can apply to a lot of scenarios. Right. So we can use it to assess new drugs, new programs for screening, that kind of stuff, new ways of organizing healthcare. Right? It doesn't have to be something biological. The thing about the randomized controlled trial that makes it so interesting, well, two things. One is the randomization process, and the next class we'll talk about methods of randomization. The other thing is the selection of the controls. So here we've got controls with no exposure, that is, didn't get the drug. And here we have the current treatment. Does anyone know what the current treatment's all about? What's the current treatment group supposed to be for? Yes?
It's the standard.
Yeah, the standard. So in this particular example, we have 3 arms. We call them arms, not groups. So in a randomized controlled trial, there are arms of treatment. So one arm will receive the new drug, the new treatment, the new curriculum. Another group, another arm will receive nothing. And a third arm sometimes receives the standard. So let's say we're dealing with a drug to reduce serum glucose levels. Okay, so, and we have diabetic patients in all 3 groups. So this group here of diabetic patients will receive this new drug, this group will receive no drug, and this group gets the current thing that everyone's taken, that all the people are prescribing. So where is the ethical tension here in the example I just gave you?
Well, some people are not getting any treatment, so they could die.
That's right. So this group here, we already have a treatment. How come these people aren't getting it? Because they could die. That's a problem. So very often we actually don't have this group, this arm. It's usually this one. We're dealing with drugs that are life-saving. But this is the ideal scenario, because we can compare these two to see how much better the new drug is than the existing drug. We can compare these two to see how much better the new drug is than nothing. And think about this, though. If I've got a new drug, it's probably always going to be better than nothing. It's very rare that something isn't better than nothing. We don't really care about that. What we care about is it better than what we currently have? So this is really the more important comparator anyway, as well as being the more ethical one. Now, if these two end up being the same, well, that's really a problem. That means our current treatment, in fact, is no better than nothing. Okay. So this is what it looks like. So let's say we get only 2 arms. And the 2 arms are, one gets the treatment and the other gets the control. In this case, I've used the word placebo, and we'll explore placebo in a bit. I know you've seen it before, but we'll go over it again. So before we decide who goes in what group, we have to randomize. So we begin with a study population, a group of people who are eligible for the study. Let's say they're diabetics. And we've decided we'll send out a pamphlet to a bunch of diabetic doctors in town. We'll say we have a new drug that we want to test out, and we need some people to enroll in our study. That's the term, we enroll them. So we have a bunch of people, a bunch of names on our list, and we decide if they are eligible for our study by going through our inclusion and exclusion criteria. Maybe those criteria include, we don't want people who are on the threshold of death. No with extreme heart conditions, just some people recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. We don't want people with extreme mobility issues or really advanced disease. Maybe you want people who have never taken a diabetes drug before. All kinds of various criteria can be applied. So once they are made eligible, we randomize. Now, the randomization is a fascinating process. There's an entire career of people who specialize in randomization. This is not the same as random selection. If you remember from one of the earlier lectures when we talked about doing a telephone survey, right? When we had a sampling frame and we selected a random sample to test, and we use that random sample to extrapolate about the rest of the group. For example, if I randomly select 20 of you and measure your heights, and I use that information to infer the average height of the entire university population, that's an example of random selection. I've randomly selected a bunch of you to represent the whole. That's not the same as this. Random selection is not random allocation. Random allocation is when I'm going to decide randomly who goes in this group or that group. Let's say you are my study population, all of you. And let's say I've got, over here is my drug group, and over here is my placebo group. Now, the most common way you would think of to establish a random allocation is flip a coin. So first is you come up to me, I flip a coin, I get heads, you go there. You flip a coin, I get heads, you go there. Flip a coin, tails, you go there, and so forth. That's the easiest, most random way of doing things. What's the danger of doing that? There's 100 of you, I'm flipping a coin for each one of you. What's the danger? Yeah.
Well, you could, by chance, put all the women on one side.
Exactly. By chance, I could get actually all of you on one side and none of you over there. Or 99 of you over here and one of you over here. Or all the women over here and of the four men, the four men over there. All this stuff is possible. All right? So we'll talk more about this next week. Why don't you think about this for now and think about how random allocation doesn't solve all the problems up front. If there are certain key things I have to assure, among them balance is the word we use to mean equal numbers on both arms. If balance is important to me, I need a strategy that will assure balance. If gender representation is important to me, I need a strategy that will ensure balanced gender representation. If it's important that I get balanced representation amongst people with no type 1 diabetes in their families, I need a strategy to ensure that. Otherwise, randomization will not account for that necessarily. What randomization accounts for, and this is the key, is it allows the probable equal distribution of the factors I'm unaware of. Because there's probably some things that are biasing you in some way or another towards having a response to this drug that I'm unaware of. Randomization, supposedly, if done correctly, will account for that. Again, we'll cover this in more depth in the next class. Okay? So why do we randomize? We randomize to ensure a somewhat equal distribution of potentially confounding and biasing factors. Now, blinding is different. What's blinding in the context of an RCT? Yes?
Like when we experiment with a study group of patients don't know what group they're in, so they're double blind.
Okay, so what's single blind?
Single blind is when the clients don't know what group they're in.
That's right. Single blind is when the subjects do not know whether they're receiving the drug or the placebo. And what's double blind then?
When the researcher doesn't know either.
When the researcher doesn't know either. Why is it important that the researcher not know? Yes?
Patterns that are actually there.
I'm sorry? Say it again?
Patterns that are actually there.
They will see patterns that aren't actually there. Maybe. Let's go back there.
You can get biased, so you can start treating them differently.
There it is, right. So the researcher very often, usually unconsciously, but sometimes even consciously, will treat the groups differently if they know which group is getting the drug, which one isn't. But why is that relevant? If I treat you differently, who cares? Yeah? So they can guess which group they're in. And if they guess which group they're in, suddenly they're not blinded anymore. So why do we blind? What's the importance of blinding? Yes?
Well, you don't want people to know that they're not taking a drug.
Why?
Because then they will feel like they're not taking a drug.
So?
It will affect their outcome.
Is that what you're going to say? That's where we're getting to the placebo effect. Okay, because there's something special with the magically human animal. That somehow, if we think we're getting the thing that we think we're getting, we respond as if we're getting that thing, even if we're not. And it's a magical thing. And it's probably what a lot of alternative medicine is based on, is potentiating placebo effect. Right? But we'll get there in a second, because that's a whole lecture, which is so fascinating. So here's the diagram from the book. So we have our study population. We have randomization that goes to the drug, and this goes to the control group. In this case, they haven't got placebo, they have the current treatment. Okay? If we haven't got a current treatment, then we use a placebo or nothing. And in both groups, we see which group gets improved, the proportion that gets improved or gets the outcome. Remember, there is always going to be a bunch of people who get the drug who have no effect. There's always going to be a bunch of people who don't get the drug who do get the effect. This is the nature of population science, right? Nothing's absolute. What we care about is proportions. And which proportion is going to be higher. So the proportion is higher in this group. Proportion of improved is higher in this group. What can I conclude? Proportion of improved people is higher in the new treatment group than this group, and I conclude that the new treatment is probably better. Okay? Now, I say probably because we have a host of statistical techniques that must then be applied to see whether or not that it actually is better. And there's a whole different category of biostatistician whose job it is to just to compute the numbers around RCTs. It's a lucrative, powerful, very busy career option for you if you're interested in that. Randomized control development and RCT design and conduct. Okay, so it is the only undeniable method of establishing causality. That's why we call it the gold standard. Someone explain to me why it's the only way we know of to establish causality. We've got the Bradford-Hill criteria as a way to estimate causality, but this is the only way we know for sure. Can you see why? Yes?
Because the only thing that is supposed to be different is the treatment.
Exactly right. Because we have such minute control over the environment. If you're trapped in a hospital, locked in a room, very often we do lock them in a room and control their diets, what they're exposed to, who they see, everything about them that goes into their bodies. And the only thing different between these two groups is the cigarette or this source of whatever. Then logically, the only thing that could be responsible for this change is that one factor. That's the only reason. Now, that's over here. So we've controlled all these extraneous variables. We've also controlled the temporal relationship. We know, for example, that the drug came before the outcome. They didn't have the outcome before they entered because we tested them for it. That's how much control we have. Okay? And if they blind it, then it's kind of hard to argue that anything was untoward here. I mean, there are other potential biases here we can explore, but these three factors really lend strong support to the idea of a strong causal relationship. On the other hand, it's crazy costly. It's so expensive to lock people up in a room for weeks or months. Sometimes they're not in a room, they're just going through life in general. It's ethically problematic. So do you see why it's ethically problematic sometimes? A lot of things we cannot test via RCT. The example I gave you in the first couple of weeks of this class was smoking and lung cancer. I cannot get a bunch of people randomly and expose them to cigarettes for 5 years and not expose them to other carcinogens and prevent another bunch of people from being exposed. Right? It's not practical and it's not ethical. It also doesn't represent the real world. And this is one of the biggest issues here. Okay, so I can show in a very controlled clinical environment that this particular intervention causes this outcome. But in the wild, in the market, in the post-market behavior we call it, oftentimes the drug doesn't behave the same way because you have other factors intervening. You have other aspects of your diet, of your behavior, other exposures that are conflicting with its role in your body. So what we find here may not be applicable once it goes wild. Okay. So that's one of the strange little trade-offs here. The more control we have, the less relevant our findings become. Okay, as I mentioned already, random assignment, random allocation, randomization doesn't guarantee equivalence, doesn't guarantee balance. What we want here is to maximize the chance of other factors being equally distributed. So again, next class we'll talk about methods of doing so, because randomization is a fascinating science unto itself. Now, an interesting thing happens. Sometimes, let's say I've randomized you into the drug group here and the placebo group over there. Sometimes we need to change you. Why do you think that happens sometimes? Got to change someone from the drug group to the placebo group, or the placebo group to the drug group. It's a rare thing, but it happens occasionally, yes.
If people are dropping out of either group, you might have to adjust for numbers.
No, you wouldn't do it for that reason. But people do drop out, and that is a problem. It's true, yes?
It's like for standardization.
I'm sorry, say it again?
Down more women or more men.
Interesting, I have to rebalance. No, you wouldn't do that for that reason, because you control that before you even start, yeah?
For side effects.
Side effects, yeah. So certain kinds of adverse effects, we may need to break the seal of somebody. Breaking the seal means we find out exactly what drug they're having, because if I'm the investigator, I don't know. It's sealed somewhere in a safe. We open up their envelope, oh, they're getting the drug. We have to change more, because maybe something weird is happening to that person. And we don't want them to be horribly sick, so we break their seal, oh, they're getting the drug, they're having an allergic reaction, let's put them in the control group instead. Or they get tossed entirely, and vice versa. Usually it's this group to that group. Okay? So it doesn't happen that often, but often it does. The question then becomes, what do you do with their data? Because they're in the study, you can't just toss them. They started the study. The fact that they got sick or had some kind of reaction, that's part of the experience that you care about. It's a real problem. So do you pretend that they got the drug, because they did, or do you pretend that they didn't get the drug because they're in that group now? What do you do? So, yeah, is that hand better go up?
Can you do like we did in another class, do like for some years? So like the time you were in one.
Yes, you can do that. You can do some fancy analysis. But before we get there are two philosophies of analysis that I want to introduce to you. One is called the on-protocol analysis, or per protocol, and the other is called intent to treat. So the on-protocol or per protocol analysis analyzes everyone based upon what they actually got. Right? So if this person had a reaction and I move them from the treatment group to the placebo group, I still pretend that they're in the treatment group because they got it. They got the thing, right? So when I do my math and compute incidence rates in this group and that group, this person will actually be in this group and increase their incidence rate by 1 or whatever it might be. Okay? The other way of doing things is the intent to treat group. Okay? The intent to treat is you analyze them as if they were still in the group they began with. And this is considered to be the better way. There's a saying. The saying goes, if you randomize, you analyze. In other words, the second we place them in these groups, then that's where they stay for all intents and purposes in terms of statistical analysis, even though they're over there now. Can you suggest a reason why this is considered to be superior? Methodologically. Doesn't make any sense, right? Because you figure, hey, they analyze them by what they actually got, not by where they started. But we're saying that you analyze them by where they started, how you intended to treat them in the first place, not how you ended up treating them. This is better. Why is this better? It's a philosophical argument. At what point did the experiment begin? Did it begin when they received the drug, or did it begin earlier? Began earlier. When did it begin? Yeah, it began, one could argue it began when I first recruited my team, or I got the grant or whatever. But statisticians will say it began the second you randomized. The second you started putting people into groups, the clock started ticking. So the process of randomization is part of the experience, part of the experiment. And we care about that. So the fact that you switched over doesn't matter. This is what we cared about, is that they came over here. And the fact they moved over there, that's part of the experience of coming over here. Kind of see that? Right? So we don't care so much about the effect of the drug, even though we do. We care about the effect of you coming over here to receive the drug. So that's called the intent to treat method. The other one is the per protocol or on protocol analysis. Intent to treat is considered to be superior. If you randomize, you analyze. As mentioned, the control group selection is pretty important. Right? So we either receive a standard intervention, placebo, or no intervention. I've offended some people, they're running away. Okay. Here's some examples historically of some interesting trials. So this is an unplanned trial. I'm going to read this out to you. This is from 1500s. At length, my oil lacked, and I was constrained to apply in its place a digestive made of yolks of eggs, oils of roses, and turpentine. That night I could not sleep at my ease, fearing that by lack of cauterization I would find the wounded upon which I had not used the said oil dead from the poison. So here's a physician who is typically using cauterization, so heated metals pressed against wounds to stop the bleeding. But he couldn't. He didn't have enough oil to continue the cauterization, so he said he made up something made of eggs and oil and turpentine, used that instead. So he raised himself early to visit them, and he found those who had applied the digestive medicament feeling but little pain, their wounds neither swollen nor inflamed, and having slept through the night. The others to whom I had applied the boiling oil were feverish with much pain and swelling about their wounds. Then I determined to never again burn thus so cruelly the poor wounded. So this individual, by accident, did a controlled trial where he gave a bunch of wounded people boiling oil to cauterize their wounds, and some other ones this little digestive that he calls it against the wounds, and found that these people were just as well as the ones who got the boiling oil, and he vowed never again to boil people because this works fine. If you look at it carefully, it's the turpentine, clearly that's doing the work here. It's killing the germs, right? So as the science evolved, more examples of this manifested. So here's a planned trial. That was unplanned. This is planned. So do you know why English sailors are called limeys? Who knows why? English sailors, I call them limeys because they carried limes after 1800s. They carried limes in their holds. Why they carry limes all the time? Yes. To prevent scurvy. So scurvy, for hundreds of years, no one knew the cause of scurvy. And the British Admiralty spent lots of money and effort trying to figure out a way to prevent it. For the longest time, they had grog, which is a kind of, alcohol on board ship for a number of reasons. One, it keeps the men kind of dull and easy to control, but also they thought grog prevented scurvy. And even though this trial pretty much confirmed the fact that citric acid, some kind of vitamin C, prevents scurvy, it took them a long time to figure it out still and went back to the grog. Anyway, here's a case where he had 12 patients scurvy on board the Salisbury, which is a ship at sea. 2 of them had cider, 2 had guts of elixir vitriol, whatever that is. 2 others took vinegar, 2 had seawater, 2 had oranges and lemon, and 2 had bigness of nutmeg. It's a good name for a band, bigness of nutmeg. And here they saw that the most visible good effects were perceived from those who used orange and lemons. Therefore, he concluded that orange and lemons were the best treatment for scurvy. End of story, one would think. It took him a while to figure out that, in fact, he was right. But that is a case of a planned trial. And he actually has several control groups here. Well, not really control groups, they're different arms of a study. He didn't have a main intervention, he had a series of interventions. But that's pretty advanced for the time. This is good too. This is a story. One day when I was a junior medical student, a very important Boston surgeon visited the school and delivered a great treatise on a large number of patients who had undergone successful operations for vascular reconstruction. At the end of the lecture, a young student in the back of the room timidly asked, "Do you have any controls?" And the great surgeon drew himself up to his full height and said, "Do you mean, did I not operate on half the patients?" He said, "Yes, that's what I had in mind." And the visitor's fist came down as he thundered, "Of course not. That would have doomed half of them to their death." It was quiet then, and one could scarcely hear the small voice ask, "Which half?" It's a true story. And the last example here is, do I have an example? Yeah, I do. Okay, before I get to the last example, we have this thing called historical controls also. So historical control is when maybe we cannot find individuals to not give something to. In the case of a dangerous intervention or dangerous disease that needs to be cured, let's say it's Ebola, all right? And I can give you either my magical cure or nothing. Well, I gotta give you something. and I haven't got any standardized treatment. Maybe in the past, somebody tried something else. And I can go through the records and say, in the past, this evil Nazi doctor of 1943 gave a bunch of patients this. I can use that data to compare to today's data as a kind of historical control. That's not very common, but it's a possibility. Okay. So this is an example of, oh, this will be interesting. Okay, so a sea captain was given samples of an anti-nausea pill to test during a voyage, and the need for a control group was explained to him. So upon return, the captain reported the results, said practically every one of the controls was ill, and not any one of the subjects had any trouble. So those who got the pill had no trouble, all the controls got sick. The stuff is wonderful. And so he was asked how he chose the controls and the subjects, and he says, I gave the stuff, the pills, to my seamen, and I use the passengers as controls. So where is the bias in his approach? Yes?
Passengers aren't used to the seas.
The passengers are not used to the seas. The passengers were guaranteed to get ill, and his seamen were guaranteed to not get ill. So the system was gamed to show, well, is it gamed toward the null or away from the null? Away from the null, okay? It's gone toward the null, would have found no result. He found a result. So obviously the selection of the controls is very important. If he had randomized, he would have had in the control group some seamen and some passengers, and in the treatment group some seamen and some passengers too. Okay, so here's an example of simultaneous non-random controls. What this is a way of getting control group based upon a bunch of people come right now. Okay, so let's say we're in a clinic, and you're all patients in the clinic, and we decide we're going to do a test, and we'll say, okay, you're going to get the drug, and you're not going to get the drug. That's a non-random allocation. This happens all the time. Or you self-select, they'll say, who wants the drug? And those come forward will get the drug, and those who don't will not get the drug. We do this all the time. It's not ideal, but it's a controlled trial. It's not a randomized controlled trial, though. Okay? Now, the definition of a non-random control is when you can predict who the next individual is going to be. So I know the next person is going to be someone who didn't put their hand up, right? I'll be the control group, that sort of thing. So here's an example. This is BCG vaccination against TB in New York. Here's the data. This is a real study. Okay, so here we got a bunch of kids who are vaccinated against the TB and those who weren't, and then we have those who weren't vaccinated. A bunch of them got TB and died, and the ones who were vaccinated, a few got TB and died. The problem is how the controls were selected. So this data suggests that, in fact, vaccination works fine. And it kind of does. Whatever, BCG vaccination has issues. So this is how it works, is the doctor at the clinic said, we parents want your kids to be vaccinated. And a bunch of parents said, I want my kid to be vaccinated. And they came down and they gave the kids the vaccination. And whoever didn't put their hands up says, you're my controls, right? You wrote this stuff down. So what kind of parents or kids do you think volunteer for vaccination? Yes.
People with like education, money for the vaccine.
Absolutely, possibly, or at the very least, parents who care about their kids' welfare, for the most part. Right? And the ones who didn't put up a hand probably are not as invested in these days. Today, there'd be other kinds of anti-vaccination issues that's separate. But back, it's about 100 years ago, back then it would have been a situation where I haven't got time for that nonsense. Let's give my kid, the thing that I came for and we're going. Right? And so those controls, if they're less invested in their kids' welfare, they have other behaviors that probably expose them to tuberculosis as well. As a result, these data were biased in what direction? Towards the null or away from the null? I'll say it again. So the controls were more likely to be poorly reared and therefore more likely to get TB, one could argue. The cases were better parented, maybe had better environments at home, less likely to get TB. So, yes? Away from the null, exactly. We found a yawning chasm between the two groups. So we're more likely to find a significant effect in this case because of the control selection. When the study was redone, in fact, the gap was much less. Right. So When we randomize, we're looking for balance and we're looking to reduce bias. What kind of bias? There's selection bias, there's accidental bias. We'll go more of that into next time. So blinding we talked about. We'll skip that over. We have the single blind studies where just the subjects don't know what they're getting, and we have the double blind study in which both the investigator and the subject don't know what they're having. There are all kinds of biases, endless numbers of biases possible in randomized controlled trials. We're not going to go into that because that's an entire lecture, that's an entire class actually. And again, if you want to build a career on biases and RCTs, it's there for the taking. Be a drug company's best friend. But I'll go for a couple of them. The first is a Hawthorne effect, and the second is a Rosenthal effect. I bet you've heard of these before, right? In other classes. Okay? If you haven't, we'll have a big review. So the Hawthorne effect is when people try harder just because they're being observed. And sometimes they don't even try harder. Their bodies perform better. And the Rosenthal effect is when we as investigators can affect the outcome simply by being investigators. This is why we need the double blinding over here. This is why we need the single blinding over here. So the Hawthorne effect actually comes from the Hawthorne works, where you put light in the factory and the workers work better because they're being watched now. People can see us, so they're going to work much harder. Right? Rosenthal effect, also called the Pygmalion effect from Greek mythology. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So the example that is often given is if you're a teacher and you're told, hey, that one student back there, we think he might be bright. I think you should watch him. He might be in the gifted class in a couple of years. And sure enough, he becomes in the gifted class. But he wasn't bright. Just the student thought he was, and so gave that student a lot more attention, and he ended up doing better than everybody else. So simply by thinking someone is doing a certain way, I encourage him to be more that way. That's an example of Rosenthal effect. So these are the kinds of things we try to avoid with blinding. Okay. Placebo. We all have heard of placebo already. So placebo is Greek for I please. So the classic placebo is the sugar pill. So you want a pill that resembles the drug that you're giving, so you can't guess which one you have. So you think it's the real one. So sugar is pretty innocuous. People give sugar pills all the time. And there is some tension with placebos and the Hippocratic Oath. Where do you think that tension comes from? Yes. Do no harm, exactly. So if I'm a physician and I give you a placebo, knowing it's not going to cure you, I've done you harm. That's a problem. I've done something very unethical. So placebo studies are very deeply investigated in RCT ethics. And again, another area of building a career around is the ethics of RCTs. And sometimes we call it the physiological effect produced by placebo. The placebo effect. Let's go back for a second. Placebo effect is when you get better because you think you're getting the drug, when in fact you're not getting the drug. So we call this the physiological effect because it's real. It's not in your mind. Yeah, the drug's in your mind, but the physiological response is real. I do have some colleagues who deny that it's real, who will say that they only observe placebo effect when you're measuring perception issues, not when you're measuring physiological issues. I don't know how true that is. For example, if we're measuring whether or not a new pain medication works, and I got a bunch of migraine sufferers, right? Migraine sufferers here, migraine sufferers there. I give you guys my new super duper pain release drug. And I give you guys my placebo, but I tell you it's my new super duper pain relief drug, okay? And you both get better. That's a perception. Pain is perceived, pain is not real. So you convince yourself your pain is less, so your pain is less. On the other hand, if you both got broken legs, and I give you guys, an actual splint, and you guys give you the illusion of splinting, your leg is going to get better and you are not going to get better. So one could argue, in fact, the placebo effect only happens up here. I don't know how true that is. I mean, I've heard reports that, in fact, it does manifest metabolically as well. It's unclear. Right. So how relevant is this for alternative therapies? Well, the idea that, and here's where I get problematic, and every year when I give this lecture, there's always a couple of students who get mad at me because they're big fans of homeopathy and Reiki and things like that. So I'm going to back up for a second and take you back to the very first lecture when I said that epidemiology is a paradigm. It's seated in the positivist paradigm that states that there is external truth that is measurable. Is that true? I don't know. That's the assumption going forward. And given that assumption, we have a set of tools called the scientific method that assess whether or not there is measurable outcomes, positive outcomes, as a result of certain interventions. Based upon those tools, the alternative therapies I'm about to discuss do not work. Okay, so just don't come after me, because every year there's always someone who sends me these angry emails about the randomized controlled trials that show that their voodoo works. Okay, fine. Okay, so here's my friend Nick and I wrote this paper a while back ago for BMJ, where we identified this other phenomenon, which is the idea that if you are in a randomized controlled trial and guess your allocation, suddenly by guessing your allocation, you know start getting better because you think you've got the drug. Now, because you're getting better, the investigator guesses that you're getting the drug, and he starts treating you better. And suddenly you're getting better on top of that. So there's like a spiraling effect. You're getting better and better and better simply by thinking you're getting better. It's crazy, but it shows you that's how much more work has to be done still. Okay, so the perfect clinical trial, we'll go back into homeopathy a second, don't worry. So the perfect clinical trial has all these other issues here, don't worry about that too much. There are methods of assessing the perfection of a clinical trial. We have some standards. Among them is something called the Consort Statement, which was developed right here at the University of Ottawa and at CHIO, which is a global standard now. And the Consort Statement is a 22-item checklist that determines how good an RCT is. I don't need you to memorize the checklist. Just know that Consort exists, and it's there to assess the quality of an RCT. If you were given an RCT and you need to assess it, I recommend getting the Consort Statement and going through the checklist. It's the easiest thing to do. Here's what it looks like. Okay. Pretty complicated. So a Consort Statement looks at how much there was randomization, whether or not a solid rationale was there, is there enough people, the outcome measure is well defined, do we know when to stop? That's a good question. So I'm measuring whether or not my headache drug works. Do I know when you have enough reduction in your pain that's, okay, we're done? Or maybe there is no reduction in your pain. How long do I wait? I mean, rules to stop, and things like that. Then we have the Haddad Score. The Haddad Score is a method of assessing whether or not there is randomness and blindedness. And Haddad gives a score of 0 to 5, okay, based upon the degree of blinding. So again, if you're looking at, and I recommend in your poster, if you're choosing to look at RCTs, apply some of these techniques and say, according to the Consort and Haddad scores, this ranks this, this, and this. Wow, the judges. Okay, so these are pretty simplistic sometimes, but recognize nothing's perfect, and there are competitor formats and templates for assessing quality of RCTs. These aren't the only ones. Recognize that the Cochrane Collaboration exists, and this is a group of scientists who conduct RCTs and systematic reviews on a regular basis and satisfy certain criterion. You can access their reviews at the Cochrane website, and they have a certain philosophy that should be adhered to. I'm moving fast now because we're running out of time, obviously. So we talked about the ethics of randomized controls already, that we need to decide what's a valid placebo. Is it okay to give you nothing, or must I give you something resembling a treatment? If, for example, is a placebo always possible? Let's say my intervention is a massage. We got to figure out whether massage reduces the incidence of headache in my migraine group. So you're going to get massages, you're going to get, I can't pretend to give you a massage. You're going to know whether you get one or not. So some things you can't really lie about. You're going to know whether you get the thing or not. Okay? So when do we break the seal and reveal the allocation? Usually when something bad's happening, as mentioned. Okay? And now, does this logic apply to alternative therapies? Okay, I got to say something about that. So in the defense of alternative therapies, very often they will argue, and they're right about this, that their intervention is not the drug, it's the experience. So let's say we're looking at some kind of Eastern remedy, I'm not going to say which one, okay? And we've separated out, here's my treatment group, here's my control group. In my treatment group, you're going to get this specific Eastern drug, and you're not. And suddenly we find there is no difference in outcome. We conclude the Eastern drug does not work. However, they will argue that it's not the drug that matters. It's the fact that you came to the practitioner. I sat you down in my office. We had a cup of green tea. We talked about your life, and you felt good about yourself. I gave you a massage. You lay on my table for a while. We watched TV. I gave you the drug. You had a nap. Then you went home. You felt fantastic. It wasn't the drug. It was the overall intervention. I can't really randomize that. I can't really control for that whole thing. So the idea of the controlled nature of the RCT strips away that nuance and prevents the whole delivery of the alternative methodology to be fully expressed. It's a valid criticism. Okay. So here's actually a quote from the British Homeopathic Association. The RCT model of measuring efficacy of a drug dose poses problematic for homeopathic research. Treatment is tailored to the individual, therefore this group methodology doesn't apply to them. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's my bias, right? So here is an RCT test done. This is off on a little tangent here, to test a new treatment for depression. So what kinds of people do you want to recruit for your study on depression? Well, you want people who are depressed, but not too depressed, because if they're too depressed, they probably aren't interested in doing your study and they probably won't conform to the stuff and all that. But you don't want them to be like not depressed enough, because they probably are going to respond to the placebo more readily, because, oh, I'm just kind of sad, not really depressed. As a result, you get only 22% of depressed people really qualify for RCTs like this, and yet the drug is applied to the entire spectrum of depressed people. The message here is the specificity and the controlled nature of the RCT only applies to a small subset of individuals, but then we use that finding to extrapolate to the full spectrum of people suffering from disease. This poses lots of problems, which is why the science keeps on rolling forward, why we keep on doing RCTs and modifying the techniques. I mentioned the fact that RCTs are part of systematic reviews. Right? So systematic review is not necessarily better than an RCT. So it takes us to Reiki. So Reiki and homeopathy are my two favorite targets for looking at, quackery. And in fact, I've tried both, and I actually enjoy both. Neither one works. But so here's a slide that shows a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. We're running out of time, aren't we? Tell you what, why don't we stop here? Let's reconvene this on Thursday, because I think this deserves a more intense time here. I got to be careful how I talk about this issue, because it makes people angry. So I don't want to rush through it. So let's stop here, and I'll see you on Thursday.